I'm so excited to be here with y'all today in this webinar, Cultivating Psychological Safety at Work using an EDI and human-centered lens. And in this, we'll be pretty much exploring aspects of the psychological safety and the work organizations and individuals should be engaging in to ensure a thriving and nurturing environment. So one thing I want to say is I am also a mother. So if for some reason you're like, why is she bouncing? I have a almost 6-year-old that will sometimes just run back and forth and just try to get some love. But I will be focused. But if you see something's going or I'm kind of moving like this, just trying to balance all of those things happening on my end. So a little bit, more about this webinar. So whether it is training, talks, webinars, etc., my goal is really to drive home that that when you step into this work, it never ends. And wherever you are in this journey, there is always areas of improvement. And I truly believe that there's no time like the now to really make an impact, do something good, and do it smart. So we all need to do our part and uphold our own social responsibility to each other in this world. And from our interaction today, hopefully this will allow you, your team, and your organization to identify some areas of growth. Also, I hope that this can be as interactive as possible, utilizing the Q&A chat box or any other ways of communicating. And I know that, with the constant of being on with videos and phone calls, it's a lot that we're navigating. So I want to make sure that, I also understand that at the same time. So my first question for you all today is, what brought you here today? What made you interested in this webinar? And if you can put that in the chat box.
For those of you who would rather speak, we can also do the raise hand feature. So feel free to use either.
Thanks, Della. And so Brienne says, you want to learn how to be a better boss. Awesome. Trying to maintain team connectedness, improve team culture in all virtual environment. Nice. Thank you all for sharing.
There's also a comment in the Q&A, which is the human-centered lens aspect of the presentation.
Thank you. We also have excited to learn about more ways I can create a positive, inclusive environment for my employees and future employees. Awesome. Very seasoned manager, but always want to learn more. Awesome. We're starting employee resource groups at work and how to best cultivate a safe culture for everyone. Awesome. Thank y'all for sharing so much and being here today. I really hope that there are some key takeaways for you in this presentation that answers the reasons why you are here today. All right. So for the first one, I think, at any time when we are talking to each other or even giving any type of presentation, I like to not assume that everyone knows what I mean. And so the first way of doing that is to really operationalize, the terms that we use. So let's start here first with talking about some of the words I'll be using today or that you will hear often throughout this EDI journey. Right. So the first one is obviously it's in the title. It's psychological safety. This is defined as a shared belief held by members of a team that the team is safe for interpersonal risk taking. And we're going to get more into that a little bit later. The next one is just the human-centered lens. Really, this is about putting people first and profits second. This is how I'm using that. And I think that's often what we don't do. It's really like when you put people first, what's going to happen is profits will follow. It doesn't have to necessarily be driven by profits. It acknowledges that when you value and include people in the creative problem solving process for which you are trying to solve, you're better able to address the issues and meet the needs of the people who are also the backbone of your business and society today. When it comes to social justice, this is really the view that everyone deserves equal economic, political, and social rights and opportunities. And then we talk about a little bit more about anti-racist. And this is important because when we are applying the EDI lens, it's going to be more from a racial equity standpoint. And I want you to be able to understand that a little bit more as well. And as you encounter this work along your EDI journey. So around anti-racist, what does this mean? This is really the work of actively opposing racism by advocating for changes in political, economic, and social life. It tends to be more of an individualized approach and set up in opposition to individual racist behaviors and impacts. Then when you come down to more of racial justice, this is a systematic, fair treatment of people of all races, resulting in equitable opportunities and outcomes for all. It goes beyond anti-racism. And then when you're hearing racial equity, sometimes these are used interchangeably. However, racial equity acknowledges that when this is met, it's a condition when one's racial identity is no longer predicted in how one fares or what those outcomes would be. And then the last two are intersectionality. This is pretty much used to describe how race, class, gender, and other individual characteristics intersect with another or and overlap. So what you'll hear me saying is layers of complexity, layers of identity. This is also another way to talk about intersectionality without using that term. So I'll be using that also interchangeably. And the last one is just EDI. And this one comes up all the time. One of the questions associated with EDI, right, is why do we focus so much on race? And that is a very, very good question. And centering this work and leading with racial equity is crucial to addressing oppression in our society today, as racism laid the foundation for this country and has been used way too long to drive wedges between our communities. And for an equitable society to come into being, we need to challenge the way racism is used as a divisive issue that keeps communities from focusing on larger systemic issues and from coming together to organize for a change that's sustainable. So when we're talking about this, the goal is just not to eliminate the gap between white people and folk of color, but to increase success for all groups. This does not mean that there is any less oppression or pain in other areas of marginalization. We know that when race is factored in, that you can see that these outcomes are more disparate across the board. And that is why we're going to be focusing on race and why that racial lens is applied to EDI work. It also acknowledges that systems that are failing communities of color are actually failing us all. So if we design for those who are experiencing the most marginalization, everyone will actually benefit. And this is actually a term called targeted universalism that you have not seen on this slide today. And so when we're looking at EDI, this is really a three-pronged approach, right? Diversity is more of about people and the perspectives. It's also about the identities, this intersecting marginalized identities such as gender, race and ethnicity, age, education and class, sexual orientation. It's really here about really decentering whiteness, right? Whereas you also have equity when this is applied, usually it's confused with equality, treating everyone the same. And that's not the case here, right? It shows up in policy, practice, and position. And it also acknowledges that when you are embedding equity, it gives everyone what they need to be successful. And then the last one is inclusion. This really gets at a sense of belonging, feeling valued, feeling welcome, feeling respected, and feeling heard. And this is important because this is some of the key factors in creating psychological safety today that we will get into talking about. And I want to stop and ask, are any of these terms new to anybody, or was there some information that you just learned just in regards to operationalizing these terms that you'll probably encounter along your EDI work journey? And feel free to put that in the chat as well. And I'll be monitoring that too, along with the link. And so what I did is I'm put these 4 pictures up here because I want you all to also see just that there are so many layers of complexity that go into this work. It is truly a journey. There's no such thing as taking one action and you're done, right? It just doesn't work that way. So this is a journey and it requires ongoing action. No one really wants to hear you or your organization just talk and talk and talk without change, because it really means nothing. And so I also say, you know, in order to continue to be on this journey, it's everyday work, right? We don't get those accolades, we don't get the recognition. It's all about doing this hard work every day in and day out and figuring out where we sit within the system. And so as we begin to talk more about psychological safety and how this is intertwined with EDI, please remember that this is a continuous learning that needs to take place. One thing I like to say to drive home this point is that we are constantly growing and changing as individuals, right? And so if we take that into account, that means that others are changing along with us as we are trying to figure out, like, what do we like? Where do we want to go in life, right? And that means when we're changing and people are changing around us, that also means that our environment is constantly evolving. And I say this to drive home the point that our learning and growing is never done, especially within this. And then I'm seeing some of the feedback around the definitions. Thank you for the feedback. I'm glad it provided some clarity. So I'm navigating the slides. If you want to know why I'm having some brief pauses. So the first one is, why is psychological safety important? This is the heart of the topic of why we're here today. And as I talked about it a little bit before, what the definition is, with it being defined as a shared belief held by members of a team, and that team feeling that they are safe enough for interpersonal risk taking. And what it really boils down to is, can I be my true, authentic self and be appreciated and valued? Are people really ready to see, hear me, and work collaboratively with me, rather than being subjected to the constant BS of being ridiculed and stereotyped, where the person doesn't even have a chance to be who they are, but yet a fictional version of what someone else wants and expects them to be. Well, I don't know about y'all, but I've been there. I've done that, and I got real tired of a real fast clicking in a hurry. You know, putting on those masks and code switching was real tiring, and you can only do it for so long, right? And so if you're not safe and this isn't present in your organization, how does one thrive, and how do you even expect your team to thrive? Well, they don't, neither do you, your team, or your organization. And so when we are looking at psychological safety being present, what you tend to see is it increases the overall team effectiveness, right? If we're talking about in regards to organizations, you see an increase in collaboration. Your teams are more willing to have more of these overlapping conversations. They're more willing to support each other. There's a overall positive well-being vibe of the place, right? And you can also see that the ideas are being driven. There's a lot of innovation and creativity. On the contrary, when it's not present, there's some ways of identifying that and ways that it shows up. You can see that through the team and organizational stagnation, turnover, where people are like, you know, I'm tired of being here. I'm just gone, like deuces, right? Just the lack of feedback, lack of when you ask something, or if you're like, well, what other ideas are there? And people are quiet and it's crickets. That'll let you know something right there. And then also just operating in silos. So it's really important to assess how you, your team, your leaders, your organization are inviting in voices, listening, and then acting, because diverse perspectives cannot be heard if they are not expressed. And when folks feel able and comfortable to do so, there's an increased sense of belonging that we talked about earlier, which means there's a feeling of being part of a team. And then that means there's an identity, right? There's an attachment to a team in the work that makes it more fulfilling, where people are more willing to drive and dig deep and have these conversations, bring up things that are uncomfortable or feeling of being judged. And so what I want to ask you all today is, how many of you here feel comfortable bringing your full self into this work? And what do you leave at home? So feel free to raise your hand and unmute yourself, put it in the chat box. I would love to hear from you.
Erica, are you there?
I am.
Perfect. I saw that you raised your hands. Please share.
Oh, I didn't. I am lucky to work in a place that we are lovingly describing ourselves as weirdos, and it's nice. Feeling like you don't have to act in a really bland, generic way.
Yeah, thank you for sharing, Erica. It's important to be able to bring who you are and not have to, put on that mask that I talked about, because then you are worrying about other things and focusing on what you should be focusing on. What about anybody else? Anyone else want to share? Like, what do you leave at home? Lynn, I see you popped up. Hi there.
Yeah, can you hear me?
I sure can.
Hi. Yeah, so I mean, I think I'm very fortunate as well of where I work, where that is certainly a benefit that you get to kind of come to yourself, to come to work as your authentic self. And as a manager, I really encourage that for those who are on my team as well, because it helps to understand, even Crystal, you shared in the beginning, you're a mom as well, and you have a 6-year-old there with you.
Yes.
So that's important now more than ever, because in my case, for our work, we're not leaving our home. So you're not leaving anything behind. Your dog, your kids, whatever, are running around behind you. You're in a meeting, you have to step away from the meeting to go help your kid get access to online school, whatever it might be. You're struggling personally because of what's going on in the community. It touches home for you. Just had that conversation starting off a staff meeting with what's going on in Portland with the Red House and, all of that. It's important that we know where is everybody coming from to start off that day, and we can do better having some kindness around that as well.
Yes, thank you for sharing. You just kind of a little bit talked about some things I'm going to talk about later on in this side, that it's also really important to cultivating psychological safety, which is also sharing personal stories, to be able to create those connections and relationships. And Anna, I see that you also popped up. Would you like to share something as well?
Sure, thank you. Can you hear me?
I sure can.
Awesome. Hey, Crystal, and hey, everybody. One thing I wanted to share is I do, again, fortunately feel I can bring most of my full self, my personality, feeling safe and heard to work, but something that I do is kind of temper my playfulness or my childish side a little bit, because I am a young woman and I'm young for my role. And so I feel the weight of needing to appear more mature or more reserved to be, respected. And so that may be an internal thing, but that I haven't heard, feedback from colleagues about that or external folks, but that's something that I just feel the responsibility of. So, yeah.
Thank you, Anna, for sharing that. I also have a connection of that as well. When I was putting on my mask, I'm a big kid. A lot of people say I'm a childish side, so I try to sometimes temper that. But now, because I'm in a space where I'm still psychologically safe, a lot of people, our organization really embeds EDI in their work. I can bring my full self, and it's appreciated and valued. You need all of those different personalities and who we are to be present and offer, just a different vibe. Not everyone wants to be the same, or else that's boring in itself. So thank you for sharing. And then I also see Benjamin. You also said, thankful to have to work in a place that celebrates everyone being authentic, and as a manager, just feeling pressure not to share my frustrations, challenges, and negativity. Yeah, it's a balance with that. Thank you for sharing. So just what you talked about today, right? It's just like who we are and our experiences throughout our life make up just that, like who we are. You would think that recognizing people's diverse backgrounds and how that shapes their unique perspectives of the world and their contributions and insight would be welcomed. Well, that's actually not the case, or we wouldn't be here today, right? We wouldn't be figuring out like, how do we create this if that was already present? In fact, you know, when we're in our working environments where critical decisions happen daily, most often you see people conform to those that are in leadership positions or ways that have always been done before. And what happens is that you do not get the full benefit of utilizing the full experience of your team because they're not able to bring themselves, and that opportunity has not been invited in. Like, what is your perspective? Where does it differ? And so there's so much that goes wrong, and these blind spots go uncovered because of that go, go, go mentality, right? There's a lack of balancing this time of effectiveness and efficiency versus that with thoughtfulness and reflection. And so really it's how do you consciously slow it down? Yes, organizations, businesses, they need to make a profit. However, it really shouldn't come at the expense of your people, of people in general. It is the shifting of profits over people and moving towards people first that will then obviously drive the profits that I mentioned before, because that's just one of my huge things, as you can probably see. But when you're doing it authentically and intentionally with your people in mind, and not that green goblin I really talk about being money. When we focus so much on that money and those profits, it really turns us into those hungry, like gremlins, you know, like the little gremlins from the Lord of the Rings. Every time they get a hold of that gold ring, they're like, ah, and they just lose focus. That's what tends to happen. And so we have to slow down that process, right? And provide space, mine for alternative perspectives, or otherwise known as mining for conflict. And conflict is good. Most of the time we think conflict is like, oh no, it's gonna rock the boat, I'll get to that later, but it doesn't necessarily do that, right? Actually, I'm gonna get to that now. So people tend to want to not speak up or be perceived as rocking the boat, right? That has a negative connotation. Like, who wants that term to be applied to them? So when you think of it literally, like you rock a daggone boat, like when you're afloat on a body of water, let's say in the middle of a sea, right? It's not like a lake. I know some of y'all probably like, well, what kind of body of water? Is it shallow? No, we in the middle of the sea and there's no land, nothing there. What do you think the risk is, right? If I'm saying that, and that's my interpretation, and you're saying I'm rocking the boat, that means I'm putting this all in danger, right? So who wants to feel that they're sinking a team or wants to feel less than? So really creating that space for voicing various points of view is critical to identifying those blind spots in our organizations, in our teams, and utilizing the talent and background of each person. Unfortunately, you see that the more identities, and this is more about intersectionality that I mentioned earlier and how I'm going to use identities and layers of complexity, the more identities that one holds, whether it's you, your team member, right? There is a greater risk because of dominant white culture narratives that tend to dictate who we are, how we show up, what the ways in which we should operate. And the higher also the likelihood of experiencing exclusion, discrimination, harassment, lack of professional development opportunities. There's experiencing of fewer role models, lack of access to networks, pay equity, and also just less opportunities for career progression. And so, you know, speaking up is really a risk. And if the environment hasn't been created to offer the points of view, people are like, I ain't about to put myself out there. And so then you're ultimately losing as a team and as an organization, where you're not able to get those experiences and backgrounds that could be valuable to identifying these blind spots that you haven't thought about. You know, so speaking up and offering these counter perspectives when the space has not been right for this, there's that fear again of making a mistake and being questioned about why you are there. Were you only given this job because of XYZ? You're a diversity hire because of all the things that you want to name. I don't want to just put names to them right now. And even if it's not said out loud, like, well, it's not said out loud in our organization because, you know, there's consequences for that. The reality is that there are stereotypes and myths that follow us all and that we have been subjected to, and we carry those interactions. So even if they haven't been said, it doesn't mean that that hasn't been an experience that we carry, right? And we're more able to perceive things that people don't say, because you can say so. There's verbal, right? There's verbal interaction, there's verbal communication, and there's nonverbal. The nonverbals can speak just as loud, right? Sometimes you get the little scratching of the head or that non-reaction where people stiff up. It'll tell you a lot of stuff. So just be mindful of that as well. And, it's something that when you're holding all of these layers of identity and marginalization, it's something that, we fight against, even if we know we're capable. And I'm putting we because obviously my identity is obviously as a Black woman. And there's a lot that comes with that when you're navigating spaces. So that's why I'm also saying we. If you want to know who we, I'm including myself in the category. And when you're fighting against knowing if you are capable, right? It comes along this imposter syndrome. So when these things come up, it happens to reactivate this trauma that I talked about earlier. Instead of you and your team members and your organization working on the issues the team is trying to solve, that energy is being taken up, analyzing the interaction and all the others to figure out how this person, how are they going to navigate the team and environment going forward and create a safe environment for them, right? So when EDI is actually present with psychological safety, there is this also fail forward fast mentality that by recognizing that there's learning for everyone involved through the offering up of new perspectives and challenging conventional ideas. There's also research that also shows that for the majority of leaders, right, which I think is really important to recognize for the leaders on the call, which actually anybody can be a leader. You can lead from any seat in any chair. That the research shows that the majority of leaders promote or praise people who demonstrate qualities that are like them. So if you are also doing that, what happens to those that don't exhibit those qualities that you value or don't mimic you, right? It creates this overall feeling of exclusion. And those that are in leadership really need to be aware of this, because when leaders do not see their own qualities mirrored, there tends to be this more harsher, critical approach of those that differ from them. And leaders can often feel threatened, by their team members, feeling like, what, they're not probably going to take over my job, or they're going to be my leader, right? And honestly, I think that's a whole another topic, but I'll talk about it anyway, because I just wiggled myself into it. It's just a weird dynamic that transpires from that fear, right? It's the saltiness or disdain of, if you're in a leadership position, kind of feeling hurt if someone that we work with or that we're mentoring or that we're supervising can become our leaders or rise above us. And I'm like, why is that, right? What is that saying about our society? What's that saying about you if this is something that you embody or something that you feel internally, and about your team? Why can't this also be seen as a success versus a threat, right? Because that's what it is. It's a success and testament to you, your team, and the person who's been working together with you and exchanging all that knowledge and expertise. And so really it's about shifting our perspective, right? And recoding like what we think about when people don't look like this. What does that mean when they don't mirror our qualities? Just reshift that, because we tend to, as humans, want to be around people who make us feel comfortable, right? And EDI and it's not really about being comfortable. It's about exploring things that you don't know, to uncover ways in which these systemic and structural inequities have been carried out for years. And so it's a fact that, when your team doesn't feel comfortable vocalizing or bringing up things that aren't working, as an organization, you will not be prepared to navigate or be equipped to prevent irreparable harm to your employees, customers, and your communities, right? And I think that is a very important part, because who wants to do harm? I don't think many of us really want to, but we do. And how can you get ahead of that, right? Part of it is creating that psychological safety, using this EDI connectedness approach, right? Where people are able to invite their own voices in. And so cultivating psychological safety is being able to recognize and admit that there are inequities within our systemic and structural framework that does not allow everyone to be successful, and instead sets up a series of advantages and disadvantages. And truly, if you can't even start there and recognize that these are the issues, you're not going to create this environment of psychological safety or equity. And so once you can admit that and say, you know what, there is some stuff there, right? I need to dive a little further. It's the beginning of the process. It's not even really the awakening part, because you still got to act. Just admitting it isn't enough. You got to do your research. You got to learn the truth. You got to put in that work, right? I always do my Rihanna, like, you got to work. That's what it is. It's constant, right? And what has been readily taught in our institutions is from more of a colonized and inaccurate mindset. And what does that mean? Well, it means that the narrative being told has been constructed based on power, domination, control, and maintaining that status quo. It is saying you are trying to save a group by introducing them to Christianity, teaching them how to behave properly so they don't continue to behave as savages. Does that sound familiar? That what was done to our Native and Indigenous peoples, right? And so if you are embracing diversity, right, it's also ensuring that there's representation from different identities, various identities, such as racial groups, gender, ability, backgrounds, cultures that bring in these new perspectives. You know, employees, people, they need to feel accepted for who they are and valued for what they can bring. There is no way to know if you're going to be achieving the goal, if you're doing well, and say like of belonging, without broad and candid input from people of different groups that are different than you. And so when you're practicing inclusion around this three-pronged approach, and you have a strong culture of this, you're gonna start seeing these higher rates of psychological safety taking root. And this happens because diverse perspectives are likely to be heard. You're able to plan and preemptively identify things where there were previously blind spots, because now more people are willing to offer perspectives that hasn't been your experience, right? And so for psychological safety to be present, you need to engage in this EDI work, right? You don't just create psychological safety without actively working on this framework. It is one way to ensure that your organization is on their EDI work and EDI journey, and it comes with all three of these when they're in action in effect. And all of this together helps to cultivate psychological safety and create a thriving environment where people can be their best and authentic self, fully contribute their experience and perspectives without penalty and fear. They feel like they're doing their part, and they understand that it's their responsibility to uphold social good and do the work. People are more able to explore and learn by trying new things that can lead to innovation, creativity. And you also see that people are working more collaboratively and thinking intentionally as a team versus just let's just push it out. And so what are some ways to create psychological safety? I'm talking about all these things. We've been in and out, and I want to give you some really solid points of where to go. And so really, in order to, create, psychological safety, it's most effective when coming from a leader of a team in an organization, yet it is still everyone's job. So everyone's responsible to doing this. And so the first one is shift the perspective of what is failure, right? Often we think failure is like, oh, all is lost. When in fact, if you reframe that, right, mistakes can actually be successes if we're willing to see the learning and growth opportunities from this, right? If we look at it as what not to do, it can guide us on the next path of what we should do. The next one is I have mining healthy conflict. I also can call it inviting devil's advocate by creating other scenarios to get people's perspectives on what's being missed to hear from others without fear. So really intentionally creating that process. It should be an active part of every decision. When people say, oh, that's a great idea, and everybody's nodding their head, you're like, the job there is to be like, so if we're all in agreement, what the heck are we missing, right? So really just mining that part. And then the next one is, encourage contributions of diverse perspectives. Acknowledge and publicly reward team members for speaking up, for offering different ideas, for admitting, an error or a mistake, and rephrasing that also as a learning opportunity, right? Asking questions versus, because often when we ask questions, we feel that, that people are going to think less than us, like we're not capable of doing our job. And that can be far from the truth, right? It helps us to give a better understanding, to figure out, well, what is this person thinking? And then when you are publicly acknowledging your team and when they are giving you contributions, what I don't see a lot of is, just like we cite in papers where we get the idea, prop that person up. Like, yeah, this idea came from so-and-so and it motivated me, inspired me to think X, Y, and Z. Give props to people, right? And not just trying to make it seem like it's your idea. The next one is share personal stories, right? Doing so acknowledges that, the personal and the work are related. So long, we always said in the society that they are separate, and they're really not. They really inform each other. We're at work so long that it is part of our personal, right? And so sharing these personal stories creates these deeper and more authentic connections between each other and your team, where people are more willing to divulge and feel comfortable vocalizing things that are varying perspectives, or even bringing in, like, this is what I'm bringing in today, so that people know where you're at. The other one is just offering developmental opportunities. Maybe on your team, you see someone who hasn't necessarily had a chance to lead something, right? So maybe they take a lead on a project, a volunteer opportunity to continue to keep getting experience. Another way is identifying mentorship opportunities for folks to be a mentor as well as a mentee on both ends. And when you're also doing this, you also want to pay attention to all the different layers of identities. For instance, if this is a Black person, you also want to identify someone who looks like them, because there's going to be certain barriers they're going to have to navigate that a white person won't necessarily understand, right? So you probably want to identify different mentorship opportunities, one within the content that's specific, and also just someone who's been in the workforce, who has been able to not necessarily navigate all the challenges they're going to necessarily encounter. And then we also have EDI training. Again, this is ongoing work on some internal self-assessments to track where you and your team are and what else needs to be done. And also, when you can, I know sometimes this is hard, especially in nonprofits budget-wise, working alongside a practitioner, but this is really crucial, because if you don't necessarily have that foundation or are aware of the trauma and the triggers that you bring, there's a lot of damage that can be done with this work. And when you're working with a practitioner who is trained in doing this EDI work, they're able to facilitate more of an intentional process and help to highlight some of those blind spots when you're new. Then we also have be consistent. This is huge, because what happens all the time is there's these unwritten rules on what success looks like that really runs counter to this inclusive environment that we're working to create. For instance, there's this 9 to 5 workday, right? But then there's this unwritten rule that those who stay later are really dedicated, right? This is really kind of inconsistent. Or if you notice, you have an employee that does a presentation, right? And every time there's questions being made to this employee, but another employee gets a presentation and there's no questions. So be consistent across the board, because it could also be making people feel like, something's wrong, or are they picking on me? Why am I being excluded? And then last one is just the value of diverse employees. It's important to make sure that there's representation across the board. And what I mean by that is ensuring that within all levels of your organization, especially also in leadership, that people and employees can see themselves, because if it's a homogenous environment, it's going to be very hard to create psychological safety, because the message that's being told is you are not welcome here. And then also just make a plan with your team. When I'm talking about making a plan with your team, there's some really good questions you can ask to start creating this environment. You can ask, like, what do you need in order to feel comfortable and safe? Have those discussions, right? Because you can't just say, I'm just going to create psychological safety. There has to be this point where we're also going to talk about it. You know, how will your team members communicate their concerns about a process that isn't working? And what challenges are you having with speaking up within the context, the group context, and how can we address those concerns? We can even talk about, like, if there is failure, how will we respond to failure or bad news? What are we going to be doing as a team, right? Or what are the norms for managing conflict? Because oftentimes when there are competing views, conflict is seen as something as negative when it could be a very positive thing. So creating those norms on how do you do that? How do people speak up? And then I want to take some time just to pause to see if there's any questions or anything that anyone wants to add before I kind of go to the next slide. Because I don't want to just be talking the whole time, which I kind of am, but I can't see you all, so I don't know what's going on. So I just want to pause and give you space and time.
Crystal, I just want to say thank you for all of the sharing that you've provided so far. I know it's really hard to talk to what feels like yourself. So I really encourage everyone to either raise your hand or include a comment in the chat box. I think it will create a more robust experience.
And so my question so far, here's a good one. Just put a yes or a no. Has this been helpful so far? Yes, no. Yes, yes. And if it's no, that's okay too. It's all right. I know we all think differently, and so sometimes it needs a different presentation, or you're expecting something else, and that's okay. See, that right there is mining for healthy conflict right there. And then I would go a little step further. Well, tell me what would you have liked to have seen, right? Thank you all. And I will keep monitoring that as well. The next slide I really want to talk about, because I talked a lot about, you know, organizations from a team. I want to talk about how it really takes us all. You know, these past few years, not to mention the past hundreds of years, so I'll just go into a downward spiral on that one. But let's talk about, you know, the past few years. Let's even talk about this year and how it has been a lot of painful realities of the racial inequities that exist in the foundation of our systems and structures, from police brutality to education and housing. You know, it also has highlighted a lot of gender inequities with the countless murders of trans lives, you know, also the pay inequities from gender as well. And you have occupational and wealth inequities, even with our ability and privilege to work from home in this pandemic. And with this, there has been more attention to EDI work and the responsibility of organizations to do more, not just focus on just the business, because we're not robots, we're people, we're humans, right? There's so much more that make us up. So at the same time, I would be remiss if I did not bring it down to the individual level. And so it's really hard to also point fingers and hold also, so I'm not even going to say what I'm going to say. I'm going to go back and say it's hard to point fingers when individuals really aren't doing the work, right? Because we as individuals, we do make up these organizations. Organizations are made up of humans. So in the true sense, it really lies on each of us individually to transform and create the society we wish and hope to see that is equitable and sustainable for generations to come. But we have to put in the work. And Keg, you've heard me say this before. I think Della has heard me say this before as well. Elaine, you might have as well. But I will keep saying this, and I'm going to say it again. There's this thing called fault versus responsibility that I love to drive home. And it came out of this book by Mark Manson, and it's called The Subtle Art of Not Giving a Fuck. Really good book. But anywho, the whole point is that, what we inherited as a society may not have been our fault because we were not born at the inception, right? However, once we were made aware of the issues and we've heard on ways to act, it then becomes our responsibility to do something, right? And then if we are made aware of that responsibility, we're made aware of all the issues and we refuse to act, it then becomes our fault. And so that's the difference between fault and responsibility, right? Because I hear a lot of people say, well, I didn't create this. No, but we inherited it and people talked about it. So you consciously decided to not listen to all the issues and say, well, it doesn't apply to me because I didn't create it, but yet there's benefits from it, right? So this is important because when we learn that it becomes our responsibility to act and we don't act, it becomes our fault, right? Because we're perpetuating the system. And when it's our responsibility, we have to do the work, right? What I say is the same energy you put into researching what style you're gonna wear your hair in, what hair dye you're gonna put in there, what color you're gonna turn it, the kids schooling, what education system, what school, what neighborhood, what diet works best, if it's paleo or if it's low carb or whatever it is, what clothes you like, the style, the housing or food or anything we care about, right? That same energy has to be put here, right? That means you just can't attend this webinar or do a 1-off or a 2-off, a 4-off or a 10-off, you catch my drift, right? This is a perpetual process. That means it does not stop. And it can't stop if we want to better ourselves. We want better for our loved ones and those that are coming up behind us. So they don't have to deal with the same painful and hurtful and damaging shit that we did not own and take responsibility for to create true change. So there's someone who reminds me of Maya Angelou. Thank you, Mary Beth. If you know better, you do better. Yes. And I'm also paying attention to time at the same time. So it's important to know that because there are things that we have to do. We can't just blame organizations because individuals make up the organization. So that means there's work that we all have to do because we make them up. That's the drive home point. The next one is just, this is what I'm going to skip over for sake of time, unless we have time to go back. I want to just talk about just some tips for individuals when you're navigating environments that that psychological safety where it's not present. And these are pretty much just some grounding techniques to help you focus instead of going down that road that really isn't beneficial because it can just take you out of your focus. And this is a rabbit hole. I've been down there, right? I'm pretty sure a lot of you have been down it. And it's unfair because someone else fucked up, right? And now they left you with the bag of shit to deal with and you have to process it. So I want to provide you all with some techniques that will vary from person to person, but they can kind of ground you so that you can focus on what you also need to do. Now, what I'm saying, what they did ain't right. As you said, they say it fucked up. At the same time, what can we do to help you get to a space to where it's not that downward spiral and it continues to keep affecting you? One of the first ones I have is breathe, right? This physical sensation of breathing in, breathing out, just being present with your body, paying attention to how your heart's moving, how fast it's moving, right? Just enjoying that breath of life, because that's something that we all take for granted. Well, I'm not gonna say all, some of us take for granted. Then we also have utilizing your senses. There's eating something, that's me, because I already told y'all I'm a foodie. Well, Keg said that. You can hold something or smell something. You know, it could be the sensation of a warm mug, holding that between your hands, or those little hand squeegee balls, or just eating something like something sweet. I just went to Tous Les Jus right before this. That's one of my favorite spots. Or taking the smell of something pleasant to you, like lavender, lemon, orange, or some type of perfume. You can also get moving, right? It's either stretching, taking a walk outside, or going to a place with your favorite view, or even exercising to take your mind off what just happened, that you can process, reflect, focus on what you also need to do, so it doesn't take you out of what you need to do. There's also drawing. They have those like little intricate coloring books. Like for me, like to each his own, that's what I say, it will vary. Like for me, that will just increase my anxiety. It's like, there's just too many things and I want to make it look good. But for some people, it's soothing, and if that's soothing, do it. You can also listen to music. Also pay attention to the music, because I know sometimes if I get frustrated or angry, I got some really just high beat music that's really not giving me tons of positivity, and there's a lot of things I can say. So I also have to listen to music, but listen to some other music that will give me that calm. And then also, talk to your support system. If you're going into a meeting and how these meetings go, set up some time with the person that you talk to vent, so that when you do, it kind of reinforces, I know it ain't me. This is the systemic and structural issues, right, that are showing up in the fabric of our society and in your work and everything else. And then I also have this really awesome little graphic that kind of shows some other grounding techniques as well. There's also, take a shower, listen to nature sounds, drink some water, hold a rock, observe the clouds, whatever, really resonates with you. And sometimes it's going to take some time to figure out what are those things that can calm you down. And then from that, I'm looking for my mouse, my apologies, y'all. Real quick, what's a time check? Keg, how many more minutes do I have? Because I don't know if I want to go back to cover something or not.
We didn't plan on doing any opening it up for questions for another like 5 minutes. So if you wanted to take another
Awesome.
couple or 3 minutes to go back, I think that'd be great.
I do, yes. All right. I'm going to go back down to here because I think this is one of the most, not even one most important, they're all very important. But I think I feel like this, talking about the journey of EDI work, the journey of creating psychological safety, I feel like these are some really good basic starting points and reflections that need to be done at any time you're doing this work. Basically, should be done all the time, right? The first thing is sitting down and saying, like, when someone comes to you with a situation or they want to talk, right? When they're bringing up instances of pain and hurt, sit there and think, am I listening? Have I listened to what this person is saying? And what did I take away? Did you hear the pain, the hurt, the frustration of what people are saying? Or was kind of like your first response is invalidating the issue? Well, I've never experienced it from this person, so I guess that means it doesn't exist, right? Yeah, that's not the case. Again, because of the intersectionality, because of your identities, there are things that will happen and people will come to you and talk to you and vent about to get perspective, or just to talk, right? That you may not understand. But the point is, how have you been there to listen and support that person who is coming to you? Because obviously we all have blind spots in some areas. There's work that we all have to do. How did you let them know that you heard them, validated the issue, versus giving some anecdotal points like, well, if this was the case, then this. For instance, I'm gonna give a better example. I remember at one of my last positions, I went to the HR manager and was talking about some sexual harassment, right, that I encountered. And the response that I got was this. Not that, you know what, that is horrible. How can I support you? What do you want to do? I got this. Well, Crystal, worst case scenario is if you were the aggressive one, or if you did something wrong, we can go through mediation. Yeah, that's not validating the issue. You're not hearing what's going on, right? And so just pay attention to your response. The next thing is, have you engaged in conversations? Not the easy ones, but the difficult ones that you want to run away from because it makes you uncomfortable, because you're not familiar with it, because there's a low level of tolerance around the issues or topics, right? And what about the conversations and the topics you know nothing about, right? How are you growing and challenging yourself to learn more around the privileges you hold, right? And then also, are you looking within, right? Did you hold space to not enter into resistance when someone's talking to you, right? Putting up a defense mechanism, like, yeah, I know they ain't talking about me because I don't have a racist bone in my body, or I'm not homophobic, or, you know, all of these things that come up. There's always some type of story we tell ourselves, right? Are you minimizing that story to sit with it and see if there are ways that you, your team, your organization contribute to the issues that we face today? It's important to not only examine the organization, but ourselves. It's right there. I think self-reflection is key. If we're not willing to look inside, it's hard to see that extrapolate also into organizations, because again, we make up those organizations. And we need to also acknowledge how our privilege shows up and how we use our power and how we continue and how we can therefore redistribute our power. And so I think that it's important to keep in mind and begin practicing these critical thinking and introspective questions in every process and everything that you do, because a lot of it is white dominant culture has been disguised as being effectiveness and efficiency. It's about checking off boxes. It's not really providing that time. We don't give enough time to the reflection part, because it's like, oh, if we wait too much time, then we're missing out on money. We're missing out on profits, and that's just another day, another dollar. No, that's not the case. It's really just busy, go, go, go. And the reflection is easily forgotten, and there's not enough time to process it. And creating this space and practice for active introspection can really make a big difference in connecting with people, building trusting relationships, and cultivating that psychological safety that are really needed in doing this work. And so at this time, I want to go back and say thank y'all so much for joining us today. And I want to open it up to Q&A and just hear your feedback.
And I think we can do Q&A just like we had been, either from the Q&A box or raise a hand. And Elaine, I think you're the only one of us that can see those hands going up. So if you want to jump on and ask a question directly to Crystal, feel free to do that. I think that's a great way to interact. I have a couple of questions to finish us out for just a good round out, but I'd love to hear from some other folks.
Cage, as everyone is typing or putting their thoughts together, why don't you go ahead and get started with one of the questions you may already have.
Absolutely. Crystal, one of the questions that I had while you were doing a fantastic job, that was an incredible presentation, by the way, so engaging and such a hard platform to be engaging in. I'm wondering, how would you suggest that people address leaders, I think particularly leaders who think this is just a bunch of PC BS, and that this is all just, you've touched on it, like, we don't have time for this, we got to make money. You've touched on those things, but I think for folks in the audience who might have somebody who's heading up their organization or somebody they report to who's going to come back at them with that, what's maybe a couple pieces of advice?
Really great question. I'm trying to figure out how I'm going to phrase this. One, if there's a person who is in a position of leadership and power over that person and acknowledges that, there has to be some boundaries that are driven, right? You can throw the whole book, personal coaching, EDI training, if it ain't taking place, the consequences are very detrimental to your organization and to people, and don't be afraid to let people go. Now, if there is not a position of power that is of that hierarchy, What I would say is twofold. One, you have to also weigh your risk as a person. When you bring this up, are you going to put yourself, your family, and all of those things, in jeopardy, right? Maybe it's time for you to also look for a new job. And I think that's the hardest thing to find. If you realize, if you say, you know what, the risk is I'm willing to take that risk, right? Have those conversations also with that person and figure out who is an ally or accomplice in the work, to where you can begin to use that grassroots movement. Because the beautiful thing about people is that when you have a lot of voices, we don't like to be on the outskirts. When you have, and you can leverage all these voices, and this person's the one that's just standing all alone, that can be very persuasive in itself. Being able to collectively use your voices to highlight like that issue, because sometimes it's hard to do alone when you have to worry about that risk.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that. Elaine, was there some other questions? I think I see some things in the chat and whatnot.
There's a question in the Q&A, which is, can you tell us about holding the rock?
Yes. I think holding the rock in regards to like the grounding the grounding technique, or is it rocking the boat?
I think specifically about holding the rock.
Yeah, I think, when it comes to just like holding the rock in regard, can Mary Beth, is this about the grounding techniques before I talk? I just want to make sure I have clarity around it.
Yep, that's what it's about, the grounding.
Okay, awesome.
Thank you.
So for some people, holding a rock is grounding, because there's energy that sometimes comes from the rock, depending on your practice, your spirituality, your belief, and it's just holding and being, for me, like it's one with the rock. So I also would say that if this is something that's unfamiliar to you, there's an area of research around it to say, like, how do you interact with rocks and crystals, and use like some of those breathing techniques and getting energy from those crystals and rocks. I think that's the best way that I can say it. It's just another way of being grounding. Some people feel connected to earth, and it's another way of connecting to that as well. Does that clarify it a little bit, Mary Beth? Okay, awesome. And then we also have, I'm not sure.
There's one question that looks like it popped up from Philip in the chat box. Crystal, did you want to address that one?
I don't see the question. I'm trying to pull it up.
I got it. It's right in front of me. So Philip's just saying, I'm not quite sure what my question is, but it seems like the processes you outlined today, in addition to addressing important and profound institutional and systemic inequities, are practices that would make any organization, team, or person better and better performing.
100,000%. Yes. I think that anytime that we are working to create spaces where folk feel comfortable, I think it's hard to create safe spaces and say something space without someone else actually saying this is a safe space for me. We can't dictate what that is, but the way that we do that is by, inviting voices, and acknowledging all of the systemic equities. And by doing that, we are more aware and educated around issues that affect us all, versus kind of being having those blind spots. And the more that we have that knowledge, the more that we can connect with each other on different levels that are of meaning to us, and that where our identities lie. We have a better, not necessarily understanding, but for the lack of a better word, kind of surface level understanding.
Absolutely. There's one other question from Mary Beth. Do we want to jump into that? Elaine, I don't know if there's other questions that I'm not seeing, because some of them I don't see.
Sure. Currently, there's just the one in the Q&A. And we kind of touched upon it a little bit, but I think we want to dive a little bit deeper about how to open up difficult conversations, if there's some specific techniques, or when someone is resistant, right? If you've presented these techniques to this person and yet they're still, pushing back, what other approaches would you suggest, Crystal?
Yeah, I think this is a great question. I also want to say, it takes time also to kind of integrate new learning, and just the way that adult learning takes place. So just because I think we talk about introducing it, or we talk about it as a group, I think it's hard sometimes for people to do it. So one way is really just modeling it. The more that we model it with people who we're working with, the more that people can see it inactive, and it becomes more of a culture of your team, right? Part of it is also, having those discussions. It might take a while. There might be other people who are participating, right? And it takes a while to create that level of I think, psychological safety. But I think that one of the best ways is modeling it, just having those conversations. And then if it still doesn't take, again, there's also boundary lines, right? There's a lot about, I think it causes for a larger and deeper conversation, because it wouldn't necessarily be because this person isn't offering different ideas or perspective. There's a lot more that's to it that needs to really be addressed.
I've got a question here about what advice would you give Black folks that work in predominantly white organizations and feel uncomfortable being their authentic Black self and deal with imposter syndrome? And I think that's almost two questions, right? Being authentic and then imposter syndrome as a separate. But I think all of it is very challenging when you may be the only Black person in your organization. You have what sometimes feels like not an ally there. What are your thoughts, Crystal?
Yeah. Thank you for that question. I get it, because I've been through it and I've been trying to figure out how to really respond, because some of them could be in contradiction of each other a little bit. And I'm trying not to do that. I think the first question is like, how do you be, your authentic selves? I think, again, it's really weighing the risk. Though, and I think the best way for me to tell is also through a personal story, right? Part of it's weighing the risk, right? The reason why I've been able to also take off some of my mask is also because of some of the privileges I hold, where I am not the breadwinner in my home. So that allows me to be able to do some more things where the consequences aren't as large as, oh my goodness, like, how are we going to provide for each other, right? And so I've been able to do that because of the safety net and some of the privileges I hold. I think that being your authentic self, sometimes you can do that with individual people, but as an organization as a whole, if it has not been created, they're not doing the ED work, there really isn't psychological safety, I think it's hard to do that. I don't think that's really an easy answer to be yourself. I mean, you can do that, but again, it comes at a risk, and the only person who can make that decision if the risk is worth it is that individual. Like, I'm gonna wear my hair the way I want to wear it. I'm gonna talk the way that I want to, talk. Those are the things that that you have to decide. So I don't think that really answers your question as much, because it really comes up to the individual. How much risk taking do you want to do? Because it's really up to everybody else and the organization to also still create that environment. If they're not also doing the work, then you have to hold that burden, and that shouldn't be on you.
Before we get to the next question, I would love for you to say a little bit about imposter syndrome. I think that if someone says that they don't suffer from a little bit of imposter syndrome, I think they're lying to themselves. There's always a moment in your career where you feel like you may be inadequate, or someone's going to find out that you aren't, who you say you are. And I don't think that this is necessarily a gender or a racial problem. I think it can be of all facets. There's an intersectionality of that. What advice would you give to the people who are feeling that imposter syndrome?
I think this really comes down also to work through it is your support networks, right? And it's also the power we also allow others to take up space in our mind, right? It's also surrounding ourselves. It's the power we also let people to take up in our minds. I think one is blocking some of that out, and that's for me it's a whole mental battle. I think the second one is just really a strong also support system that you can talk to, that's like, when you're having that moment and you're like, can I really do this? Was just this luck? Were they right? Your support system who knows you best will be able to talk to you. And then, then you kind of come back and have that conversation. You're like, I don't know what I was thinking. These people got to me. I'm telling you, like, nah, not today. But it happens. It really does happen. And I think if we also use that for ourselves as a point of introspection to look at all of the things that we've done, all of the things we accomplished, that can help to counter those feelings and that false narrative at the same time.
Okay, we've got one more question before we're going to wrap it up here, which is from Benjamin, who asks, if you're stepping into a leadership role in an organization that may have misstepped around psychological safety in the past, how might you best work to shift the narrative or culture toward a more transparent and safe environment? And thank you, Benjamin, for taking on that role, because I know it's hard to kind of clean up someone else's mess. So thank you for the question.
Yeah, I think also part of the answer was to that question. I think it's also in itself. I think part of it is the transparency of organizations. First, you also have to admit that you see that there was an issue and a misstep, right? And then I think the second part is also still modeling it as an organization. So the leaders are going to have to also take more of a vulnerable role of modeling what psychological safety looks like. I think it's also creating a plan, and most importantly, I think it would be important for an organization to not necessarily do it itself, to also work with a consultant that can help navigate you through that process, because sometimes when there is that issue of mistrust and there is the missteps, you need an intermediary where people can hear both sides because of that lack of trust and that power, that dynamic that exists within the organization. So utilizing a consultant as well, I think will help to begin to cultivate that psychological safety that hasn't been present.
Excellent. Thank you, everyone, for such great questions. I think that really helped just bring all the content to home. I wanted to finish with one really quick last question to you, Crystal, to just send everybody out into the world with some tangible things. What's one thing that people should walk away from today that they can go and practice and remember, if you could give just one thing?
I'm one of those people that it's very hard to say one thing. Okay, so one thing is this work never stops. You have to keep engaging and doing the work. When I mean doing the work, I mean doing the research, unlearning what you have been taught, right? So that you can challenge that foundation that was set before, and you can start creating a new path. And I think that's part at the core of EDI work that allows psychological safety to even take place. You have to work, you have to do the research, you have to unlearn these false narratives, these stereotypes, and replace them with more equitable ones that create that environment.
Absolutely. Totally agree. Elaine, did you have anything else before I just wrap it up here for everyone?
No, I just wanted to thank everyone for participating today. And thank you, Crystal, so much for sharing your wisdom and your insight. And I also want to take this time to promote our January event, which is actually with Cage on deconstructing privilege. The link to the event is in the chat box now. So hope you can join us for that January event. Like Crystal said, this is ongoing work. It does not end. And really, really happy that everybody was able to participate today. Wish everyone a happy and safe holiday and new year. Thanks again.
Thank you all
Yeah,
so much.
and thank you, Crystal, and thank you, 52 Limited. And thanks for letting me step in for Lori today to fill her big shoes. And my webinar coming up on the 13th is going to follow so nicely in line with what Crystal talked about today. It's going to be a really good pairing. So hopefully you can make that. And my last little plug that I wanted to say to the question about Black women looking to bring their authentic selves. If you haven't read the memo by Minda Harts yet, I highly, highly recommend it. Unbelievable piece of work that she gives, her perspective and personal stories as a Black woman in the corporate world and how she's navigated it. So really highly recommend that. Thank you everyone for joining, and same wishes of happy holidays and happy new year.
Thank you all.
Thanks everyone. Bye-bye.
Thanks everybody.
Bye.